Hello and welcome, guys. So glad you're here. How are we doing? My name's Isaac. I'm 20 years old. We're calling in now from Wicklow. I'm a science student studying at UCD. So glad you guys are here. Excited for this evening.
Hi guys, my name is Patrick. I'm actually Isaac's first cousin and we live in the same household on this farm down in County Wicklow. So we are isolating together and I don't think we've fallen out yet.
Not too much. Walking on eggshells right now.
It's eggshells. It is, yeah. So anyway, you're in our safe hands. Hopefully safe hands tonight. As I say, my name's Patrick. I'm a history and religion teacher. Before that, I spent a bit of time working for Accenture as a management consultant. And before that, I spent 4 years studying theology and philosophy at Cambridge University. So I love getting my teeth into the big questions of life. So I'm really excited about this evening. Isaac, tell us more about what the evening is going to look like.
100%. Finding peace in his time of suffering. Does Christianity have any of the answers? Well, I'll tell you what, guys, our world has been flipped upside down. We're now surrounded by death, surrounded by suffering, surrounded by fear. And you know what? If COVID-19 isn't making you think about the bigger questions in life, then I really don't know what will. And now, guys, if you were listening to that song at the start, actually one of the words says, I wonder why the good man dies and the bad man thrives. And I think if you're here right now, then you're kind of wondering that as well. Why is there so much suffering in our world? And is there a way to find peace to get us through it? And so, guys, I hope that we're ready to come with an open mind. Let's engage, let's participate, and let's see what we can get out of this evening. And so it's just a brief kind of outline of what this evening is going to look like. Soon we're going to hand you over to our friend Andrew. Now, Andrew's a frontline worker. He's a doctor working on the front lines. So we're really looking forward to hearing what he has to say. After that, we're going to have a short coffee break. And then we're going to go over to Steve. And he's going to give us another short talk looking at what the Bible has to say about suffering. Then we're going to have a Q&A, and that's where you guys really get involved. And now, guys, there's only one rule for tonight, and that's that there's no question too simple, and there's no question too feisty. So if you have a question, whether it be simple, feisty, or anywhere in between, please do send it in. Now, there's a whole bunch of different ways you could be sending in messages, guys. You could put it into the chat here on Zoom. Also, you could send us a message on Twitter and at Instagram at Intro Dublin. Also, if you want to send us an anonymous message, you can text us on the number you see on the screen, and that stuff might get put into the chat pane as well, so you can see that. And so, guys, we're really looking forward to this Q&A. You know, we've set out a decent chunk of time to do this, and we're really hoping it'll be a good time of discussion and just respecting each other's opinions and seeing if we can find any answers in this time.
Quality. Thanks, guys. Yeah, so guys, get stuck in. Don't hold back. Ask your questions. Give us your thoughts. Of course, let's do that in a respectful and responsible way, but I think that comes naturally. But yeah, get stuck in. Isaac, just be clear then. So if someone wants to ask a question for the Q&A and say, as Andrew's speaking, they type in their question, Andrew doesn't then stop. He comes back to it at the end of the Q&A. Is that right?
Yeah, 100%. So we're going to be collating all these questions, and then at the Q&A, then we're going to be looking after them. So we've got us guys, we've got Steve, we've got Andrew, and then we've also got our friend Rebecca. And so that's going to be the panel. So if you want, you can ask us individually, or you can just send out an open message. But yeah, all the questions are going to be done at the end.
Brilliant. Thanks, guys. And also, you listen, don't feel compelled. Please do ask questions, but don't feel compelled. It's also totally cool just to sit and watch and get stuck in from the comfort of your own sofa. Now, Isaac, let's ask a few starter questions. Set the scene before we get on to the really serious stuff. When did you first hear about the coronavirus?
To be honest, I'd say it was probably around mid-February. But at the time, I just thought it was a bit of a joke. You know, you just see it on social media, and I had no idea it was going to be as serious as what it is now. Mm-hmm. How about you?
Me? Well, I'm quite an avid watcher of Sky News. On weekdays, I like to get home 10 p.m., watch my news, see what's happening in the world. And so I've sort of been following the story since it got going at the start of the new year. But good grief, I really didn't think it was ever going to come near me. And that leads us on. When did you first realize, whoa, this is real, actually? This is going to affect me?
Well, you know, unlike you, actually, I'm really bad at watching the news. You know, at my student flat in Dublin, we don't have a TV or anything, so I don't watch the news there, and I don't really go on my phone to look at it either. So I'm normally quite oblivious to actually what's going on in the world. And so I'd say it was around mid-March, I went home, and my parents kind of had a bit of an intervention, made me sit down, watch the news. And that day actually was the day when Italy was closing its airports, and flip me, that really put the fear into me. I had no idea it was so serious.
So your parents made you watch the news?
Yeah, flipping terrible, isn't it?
Guys, it will be quite a grown-up event, this. We will have grown-up speaking later. But yeah, no, thanks, Ice. And myself, when did I first hear about the coronavirus? Or when did I first think it was real? Well, I've got a good friend who I think is with us now, Gareth, and he runs the on-field pitch security at the Aviva Stadium for the Six Nations. And so what he gets is he gathers a few brawly athletic men to come and sit right by the pitch side and make sure that if any streaker gets past the crowd stewards and onto the pitch, some big brawly guy is there to tackle him. And that big brawly guy wasn't able to come along, so he invited me to come along for the Italy Six Nations game. So I was all ready to sit on the pitch and guard the players from any pitch invaders. But then it got cancelled. The game suddenly got cancelled. A few days to go, and it was off. This is a rugby match for any of you who aren't rugby fans. And that's when I realised, whoa, this is real now. This is going to impact my life. And here we are in isolation months later.
Wow.
Yeah, but in some ways, there's some quirky, fun bits to isolation. So what's your weirdest hobby that you picked up during isolation?
I guess maybe, now that I'm actually kind of going to bed a bit earlier, I've tried to be a bit of a big boy and start reading. Yeah, I know. I thought it was going to be a bit weird, a bit boring, but actually it's not as bad as I once thought.
Yeah.
What about you?
Trees.
Even more weird.
Yeah, no, I'm big into trees. I'm big into. I keep walking / running around the same little area of our farm, and yeah, I got into trees. I think they're cool. I've got, I can now identify that's a beech, that's a sycamore, that's an oak, and even some more niche ones than that. So yeah, no, I'm like, as my sister says, I'm like Jake Sully out of Avatar. I'm kind of in with the trees.
Wow, so cool, man.
Thank you. Okay, let's get more serious. Let's be a bit more serious. It's not all fun and games. No. It's been tough, and it's been very tough for a lot of people. What's been the hardest thing about isolation for you?
Well, firstly, I just see how fortunate I am. I haven't really been affected by it too seriously. I'm blessed to be in the countryside, so I can go outside, get some fresh air. I guess the hardest thing for me has just been not seeing my mates, kind of relatively social guy. I like seeing them every day. So it's just a different way of life right now. But when you compare that to some of the things going on in the world, it really pales into existence. How about you?
Yeah, well, there has been some difficult things, actually. My brother and his wife live in London, and they both got the virus. His wife breezed through it, a couple of strepsils, small cough, fine after a couple of days, no worries. But my brother, he's had some pretty significant health complications in the past, and it hit him very hard. And for about at least 20 days, we were pretty worried about him. And it was so difficult being stuck in Dublin, him in London, because I would have loved to get on a plane and go and help him out, or at least be there, but obviously not possible. So that was an anxious time, and happily it looks like we're through it. But that was hard. And also, I'm meant to be getting married on June 26th, and like anyone getting married, I have these visions of this great, exciting wedding, all my mates, all my family, food and drinks flowing, etc. And I'm basically watching that all go up in smoke before my very eyes at the moment. So I'm not sure what's going to happen with that. So that's been tricky as well. But there's been people who've been having it a lot harder than us. There's no doubt about that. And we're very fortunate to be in such a spacious place down in Wicklow. One such guy, I suppose, is our friend Andrew, who you're going to introduce.
100%. So Andrew's one of our good mates, and he truly is one of those real life superheroes right now. He's a trauma doctor working right on the front line, fighting against COVID every single day. So he's going to come on now, tell us a bit about his personal story of faith, why he believes what he believes, and how he's, managing to find peace in this crazy time. So over to you, Andrew.
Hi guys, how are you? Thanks for joining us tonight. So like Isaac and Pat just said, my name is Andrew, originally from Taiwan. My wife Ola and I, we moved here to Dublin about 6 years ago, and we've living here ever since. So, and as of a few weeks ago, my wife and I entered a new chapter in our lives when we had our first baby boy. So it's very, very exciting times. And, but other than being a dad, I am also an emergency medicine doctor, and I currently work in an inner city Dublin hospital in the Mater. So like we're talking all evening, it's definitely a scary time that we live in with COVID-19. From a medical point of view, definitely seen the damages that it has on my patients of all types. Tonight, I want to share a little bit about how COVID-19 has affected me in my personal life rather than in my medical field. So my wife and I recently went through a very, very tough few weeks. As I mentioned earlier, we've recently become new parents to our firstborn son, Theo, on April 6th. And we were expecting him to be delivered a little bit later in June. But instead, my wife had to have an emergency section about 4 weeks ago, and Theo was born premature at 31 weeks, thankfully very healthy. Now, the suffering that I'm about to share started a week before Theo was born. So on Monday, the 30th of March, I just finished working a week of nights in the COVID section of emergency department, and I was exhausted, and I was very much looking forward to spending time to rest. Now, my wife Ola, she had an anesthetic appointment that morning in Rotunda, so I offered to drive her there. During her checkup, they found out that her blood pressure was high. So these were all signs that were a little bit concerning for preeclampsia. So the doctor decided that they would keep her in overnight for observations. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term preeclampsia, it's basically high blood pressure condition that can occur during pregnancy, and it can become a risk to mom and baby if it's unable to be managed properly. So obviously we weren't expecting this at all. I mean, all her regular pregnancy checkups have been normal up until the moment, and we certainly felt blindsided. And our main concern was that Ola was only 30 weeks pregnant and Theo was very small for his age at the time. But still we were hopeful, that this was only an overnight stay for observation and that she would be allowed to go home the next day. And because of COVID restrictions, I wasn't allowed into the rotunda, and so Ola had to go in alone after we said our goodbyes up in the main entrance. So the next morning, what happened was Ola called me to say that she had a really, really rough night. Her blood pressure was through the roof, and took the doctors and the midwives several hours in the middle of the night just to get it under control. They didn't think she would be fit for discharge just yet. So she was kept in the same night and the night after that. And it became apparent to me halfway through the week that Ola was not going to come home. Every night was the same vicious cycle. She would be put on a higher dose of medication only for it to fail come middle of the night. She was losing sleep and she was losing hope. She was also starting to feel physically unwell and weak as well. The hardest part for me, I think, was that I couldn't be there physically to support her because of the restrictions. Through regular video chats, I saw how Ola's mood deteriorate to the point where she, being a massive Disney fan, lost all desire to watch anything on Disney Plus. I've never felt more helpless as a husband. A week later, we were told that Ola's preeclampsia can no longer be managed by medication and that she needed to get a C-section at this point. At this stage, this was something that we expected. I was told be on C-section. Now, on the day of the C-section, Ola could sense an odd, peculiar tense in the ward, and it turned out there was a suspected COVID patient in a ward that day, and this put everything into disarray. Despite this, Ola was reassured by the infectious control team that I was still able to be present for her C-section. So that afternoon, I stepped into the rotunda. I went up to the ward and finally saw Ola for the first time in person since all this kicked off a week ago. I smiled at her and I said, let's go have a baby. We're trying to be very positive about it. So we walked a short distance towards the operating room just down the hall. However, the theater door opened and we were met by two nurses who stopped us in our tracks. With a stern and very sterile voice, they said, no, I'm sorry, partners are not allowed. She has to come in alone. Their instructions were met with protests from the ward nurses right behind us, who said they were told the contrary. So we're now caught in between this loud chaos and confusion between the ward nurses and the theater nurse. And in the midst of all this, Ola was led quietly into the theater. And before I realized, Ola was already inside the operating room and the theater door closed right behind me. So no last eye contact, no chance to give her a word of encouragement or even a simple I love you. She was gone and I was left behind with no further clarification of what exactly just happened there in the last 1 minute. And I think that was probably the last straw that broke the camel's back. I mean, my emotional wall came crashing down that moment. Like whatever strength, whatever composure I've kept all week whatever resilience I've honed from my training as a doctor evaporated at that moment. I was really angry at the injustice that had just happened. I mean, of all the things that have gone wrong all week, surely we deserve just one thing to go right. It felt like God did one too many. Surely it was not. It was enough for Ola to just have endured a preeclampsia in isolation, but to rob us of even that one chance of normalcy in delivering a baby together, it was just too much, God. So Ola went in to deliver our baby, who later had to be kept in an ICU for a few weeks. And I was told that I could not meet him until the time of his discharge from the hospital. Now, it's hard to capture in 10 minutes the turmoil that week has been. Many of our church friends who were in the loop described it as an emotional roller coaster, even for them. And Ola and I certainly needed their help and support because it was an incredibly difficult time for us. The guys really encouraged me to wrestle with God. This means to engage honestly with God with all your frustration and hurt, rather than being emotionally disengaged from him. So I wrestled with God. I wanted him to help me understand why Ola and I had to go through such relentless suffering that felt nearly excessive in the end. He could have made it stop. He could have allowed just one good thing to happen. If he even could have just let me enter the C-section to support Ola and see Theo physically, just so briefly, it would have made up for the horrendous week leading up to it. So I wrestled with God regarding to this. And in the end, I found peace as God began to address my heart. So first of all, part of my suffering was a result of my gradual loss of control. I wanted to help my wife, but I realized I had little control over the situation. I couldn't physically enter the hospital. I couldn't use money to buy my way in. Even my title as a specialist registrar in emergency medicine, one that I've sacrificed so much of my time and my energy into, the one thing that I thought surely was an advantage in my life in this particular type of scenario, was completely useless. I realized that I've depended heavily on things such as money, prestige, and others' goodwill in my life. And yet these things ultimately failed me when I needed help the most. However, at the same time, there was one person at that moment whom I realized I could run to for help, who would not reject me. And that was God. I can come to him simply as myself, beaten, broken, and imperfect. I became aware that I didn't need to earn a right to be at his presence. I could come to him simply because Jesus died on the cross for me, and he made a way for me to come to his presence. So it gave me great comfort and peace knowing that he was the one person I could go to in time of needs. So the second thing that God taught me was the danger of the phrase, I deserve now. So I felt entitled to good things. And when suffering happened for no apparent reasons, I raised my hand up in protest for the injustice. It has been ingrained within us to have no place for innocent suffering, both in our lives and in this world. And to this, God pointed me to his son, Jesus. God said, look at my son. He is perfect and sinless. And yet I put on him the ultimate injustice and suffering. Jesus did not deserve to die, and yet God allowed him to die on a cross for us. So the innocent one perished in our place so that we might not finally perish. And God said his justice will come, just not yet. We're so used to having everything now. So wicked punished now, righteous are blessed now. I expect the blessing of God now. I expect to know the answers right now. But in the Bible, God demonstrated repeatedly the value of faith and God's promise of things unseen and yet to come. If you and I can trust that the reality of our injustice is not the be-all, end-all, but that there is an unseen goodness in the horizon in the form of eternity, it will give us peace. So to finish, I just want to conclude by saying that it is far better to search and find God than to search and find insight to why of suffering. First of all, we will never fully understand why there is suffering. However, we're given an invitation and an opportunity to put our trust in God, who has all the insight and understanding to the ways of the universe. And like a child who fully trusts that his or her father cares and loves for them deeply, we can have that same peace that doesn't always require full understanding of our situation. So can we find peace in suffering? My answer is yes. But peace does not come in the form of full understanding to the why of suffering. Peace comes from having a relationship with God, like a child has with his father, able to see your current reality with the lens of eternity, and to be able to rest in the unknown because you trust that your father has full insight and is in control of the matter. So thanks for listening. I just want to share my story with you, and I'm looking forward to the questions and the discussions for tonight, guys.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrew. It's a powerful way to start the evening with a very personal account and a time that I know has not been easy for you. And yeah, it's remarkable the way yourself and Ola have come through it. So thank you, Andrew, for that. Now, next on the menu is the main event of the evening. It's going to be Steve, who's going to really get his teeth into the big question. But before we get on to that, very quickly, we're going to have a short 3-minute musical interlude. So Steve's chosen Make You Feel My Love by Adele. So please do stay with us, watch the music, have a little opportunity to refresh your brain cells. Alternatively, this is your opportunity to nip out, refill your cup, or do whatever needs to be done. So we will see you in 3 minutes and not a second later. Okay, Steve, over to you for your music. Okay, welcome back. Thank you, Steve, for your choice of music. I hope you've refilled your cup or you've got a bite to eat or whatever it is, and I hope you're ready now for the meat of the evening. So it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Steve. Steve Vaughan is a bit of a mover and shaker in the Dublin tech scene. He works for HubSpot in the city centre, and he actually wrote the intro course. So he's done a fair few of these over the years. He's a fellow former philosophy student, and I have to say he's as good a speaker on topics like this as I've had the pleasure of coming across. So Steve, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to you, and we're in your hands now for the next 30 minutes or perhaps a little less. Over to you, Steve.
Great. Well, lovely to be with you all. Thank you for coming. And yeah, I'm delighted to be able to share this evening. I want to do two things tonight as we look at the topic of finding peace in a time of suffering and thinking whether Christianity has the answers. I want to look at philosophical questions, or answers, I should say, to it. Like, how can a good God allow such suffering as we're experiencing right now? How can a good God allow that? Philosophical questions. And I want to look at personal questions. Andrew was good, but how can I find peace in my turmoil? Whatever the turmoil is, it's different for each of us. And Andrew and Ola have had their fair share of it, and you've probably got your share of it, and you know people. And so there's philosophical questions, there's personal questions. We want to give answers to both. And with both answers, I want to go, how does Christianity compare to what the secular person would have to say? The question tonight is, does Christianity have the answers? Well, compared to what? Compared to, if you don't believe in God, are you in any better position philosophically and personally and in trying to find peace? A few years ago on the Meaning of Life show, brilliant show by the most famous talk show host in the world, Gay Byrne, and he interviews these famous guests about the meaning of life, and he always asks, the last question is always, what would you say to the Almighty God at the pearly gates of heaven? And he had the very brilliant and famous atheist and sort of TV star Stephen Fry. And you may remember, and remarkable eloquence, a man with the mastery of the English language, Stephen Fry. And he put it like this, in answering the question, what would you say to God if it all turns out to be true? And Stephen Fry said, why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world that is so full of injustice and pain? He must be a moral monster. He is evil and capricious. A compelling quote. You may remember it. It went pretty viral on social media. But it rings true for us, doesn't it? Right now? Right now? COVID-19? Why does a God, like what kind of God would allow such devastation and suffering? And it's actually the age-old question that's always been put to believers in God. It goes something like this. This is what you study when you do philosophy. Since there is so much evil in the world, there cannot be an all-powerful, all-loving God. If he was all-powerful, he'd be able, he'd have the power to get rid of suffering. And if he was all-loving, he'd want to, he'd have the benevolence to get rid of suffering. Since evil exists, an all-loving and all-powerful God cannot exist? That's the question that's been posed to the theist for generations. There's two problems, or there's two assumptions that the atheist has when posing a great question. The first assumption is they're assuming a moral law. You see, the moment you say, wait a minute, there is such a thing as evil, then you're saying there's such a thing as good. You're differentiating between evil and good and right and wrong. You know, why is God allowing all this evil? Well, where'd you get the definition of evil? To have the good and the bad, the evil and the right, you have to have a moral law. To have a moral law that is the same across humanity, you have to have a moral lawgiver. But that's the person you're trying to disprove. You get rid of the moral lawgiver, you get rid of the moral law. You get rid of the moral law, then you get rid of the difference between right and wrong and good and evil. And therefore, you don't have a question anymore. Your objection to God is smuggled in God in the question, the objective moral lawgiver. If you get rid of him, you get rid of the moral law, your question is redundant and you've trivialized the suffering. Now, many people try to get out of that one, and I've had many debates in philosophical tutorials go, no, I don't need a moral lawgiver, Steve, to give me right and wrong and good and evil. We know, utilitarian view, that we're just trying to alleviate human suffering. Like, as long as I can try and live my life to alleviate human suffering, then, you know, that's okay. That's good enough. But that has problems. Now you've smuggled in, you're assuming that human life is valuable. But if there is no God, why is human life valuable? To quote Oxford professor of chemistry, Peter Atkins, I once saw him debate a Christian philosopher. Peter Atkins, no, doesn't believe in God, says humanity is just a bit of slime on a planet. From a previous generation, the very famous atheist philosopher who wrote a book called Why I Am Not a Christian, Bertrand Russell, said humanity is just a curious accident in a backwater. You see, you get rid of God, you actually don't have a problem again, because why does it matter if humans suffer? Because who cares about humans? Like, why are they valuable? So when questioned about the topic of suffering, Richard Dawkins put it like this. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt and other people are going to get lucky, and we won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, listen, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. In other words, COVID-19 is just evolution rumbling on. And we are dancing to evolution's music. When a loved one dies, when someone loses their job, when a father is separated from seeing his son in the labor ward, well, it's just blind, pitiless indifference, Dawkins says. I am not saying Dawkins, Russell, or Atkins are wrong. What I'm saying is they are actually having the guts to follow through with their worldview, which says if there is no God, you can't end up with this idea of good and evil, and you can't end up with the idea of human life being valuable. So all this talk of suffering being a problem, actually, you end up without a question. You see, if you're following me so far, there's something interesting that happens in all of us when we suffer. And that is, we cry out inside or verbally, why? And often we look as if to the heavens. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I was supposed to be able to see my baby boy at the birth. My family member wasn't supposed to have this trouble. What's wrong? Why? It shouldn't have been like, a world shouldn't have had coronavirus. Why? Why shouldn't our world have had coronavirus? Where does that desire come from? Why do we think our world shouldn't be full of evil and suffering? Have you ever known such a world? Where does that idea come from? Why do you think human life is valuable? I mean, if we are just a set of chemical reactions, a collocation of atoms, there's nothing more. There's no bigger reason for our existence. It was a freaky big bang against all the odds that kicked it off with no divine influence. It's all random. There's no overarching story. Well, there's no meaning. When you die, you rot. Tell me, why is human life valuable? You have to go, it isn't. You have to have the guts to follow through with your conclusion. Atkins, we're just a bit of slime on a planet. Russell, we're just a curious accident in a backwater. In a sense, we're actually not much different from a tree. We're just a collocation of atoms, just differently arranged. Yes, we've evolved a bit more. But like, we chop trees down, don't we? Well, if a few humans get chopped down, does it really matter? What's the difference? In fact, let me press you. And by the way, if you're here today as an atheist, we're delighted you're here. We want to hear you, and we want your objections, and I want your pushback. But if you're an atheist, if you don't believe in God, doesn't COVID-19 fulfill the goal of evolution? The society and our human race gets a bit fitter. A few of the weak are siphoned off. We stop giving our resources to those that are a drain on society. It enables us to progress and get stronger. And, you know, those that can't adapt, well, that's the point. The survival of the fittest. In a sense, isn't COVID-19 part of how evolution works? So we should just, again, accept it. There is no problem. Now, of course, we're going to get stronger as a society through this trauma that we're going through, this pandemic. But we get stronger, surely, for the good of the weak, not at the expense of the weak. And that's where the evolutionary worldview, I think, crumbles for all of us. We don't want the weak to be siphoned off. We want them to be uplifted. Well, then you need a reason for that. You see, here's my point. The fact that Stephen Fry gets so angry, the fact that we look to the heavens and go, why? And deep down, it's as if someone's listening to us and the world shouldn't have coronavirus in it. Maybe our reaction to evil and suffering, far from being evidence against God, is actually evidence for God. You see, you get rid of God, you get rid of the problem, your question's redundant, you trivialize suffering, but we don't want to do that. C.S. Lewis famously converted to Christianity. He was an Oxford professor, and he put it like this in his book, Mere Christianity, probably the best apologetics book written by a Christian in the last 50 to 100 years. And he puts it like this in the book. My argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? A man feels wet when he falls into water because man is not a water animal. A fish wouldn't feel wet. Now, Lewis then goes on to argue, well, I could have got rid of the idea of objective justice and just had a private, there might not be right and wrong objectively. I just feel it's right and wrong and listen to what he says. Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing more than a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too, which is my point so far in the talk. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my private fancies. Thus, the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, of right and wrong, of good and evil, was full of sense. Consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple. So again, he put it elsewhere just to make the point, if you're really the product of your materialistic universe, no God, it's just all material, no supernatural, how is it you don't feel at home here? Do the fish complain of the sea for being wet? Now, let me zoom out of kind of maybe some quite heady stuff and just bring it down to earth for you. I was driving home. I work in Dublin city centre. I live on the south side. And I was driving home with my colleague, good friend of mine. He calls himself an atheist, but he says he's a Catholic atheist. You may know those. So I'm a Catholic atheist. He takes after Darrow O'Brien. And we have great fun and respect for, and lots of banter. And we were driving home, and he was giving me a tirade of questions. He couldn't believe that I believed the Bible. He couldn't believe that I believed traditional doctrines. And he had all these questions around suffering and why God would allow and what was going on in the world. And normal sort of thing that someone like me, a believer, gets from a non-believer. And I enjoy that. And so I said, hey, wait a minute. I will answer your question if you just answer me one question. One question, I will answer you some of your questions. I'll have a go. And this is my question. I said, what's wrong with the world? We drove on in silence. He ummed and ahed. I said, seriously, what's wrong with the world? We were driving down the N11. I remember it very well, just by UCD. Why is the world such a mess? Is it a lack of education? Is it a lack of technology? Is it a lack of communication? Is it a lack of awareness? Like, surely you can't say that. Like, the problem in our world and like the Holocaust is just because we, lack of technology. Well, they used high technology, lack of education. Well, they were pretty clever people, He goes, I don't know. I haven't thought about it. And the car journey continued and we carried on. You're on this call tonight because you want to know how to find peace in suffering. A good question to ask yourself is, what is actually wrong with our world? There's a conservative political answer and a liberal political answer, but they don't cut it. The liberal political answer is that, you haven't had the right family upbringing and the right social background and all that stuff to help you. And the conservative answer is, well, they're the bad people over there and we're the good. It doesn't quite work, It's not sufficient enough to account for, say, the Holocaust. You see, if you don't believe in God and you believe you're all here by random chance and it is survival of the fittest and that those that are less fit don't survive, I have no idea why you think the world isn't supposed to be cruel, isn't supposed to be harsh. It is random. It is unjust. As Dawkins said, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good. But we all know, we all feel, we all sense, we all think that is not the case. Earthquakes, AIDS, homelessness, miscarriages, famines, babies dying, war, terrorism, pedophilia, murder, rape, coronavirus. This is actually wrong. It's wrong. It's not just a private fancy. We imagine this world shouldn't be with disease and pandemics and suffering and death. None of us have ever known such a world. None of us have ever experienced such a world. But yet in our consciousness, we think we're supposed to live in that world. Why? C.S. Lewis said it's like a fish constantly being surprised by the wetness of the water. Where does this sense that our world is wrong come from? So for me, it's because we were made in a perfect world by a God, and then we rebelled against that God, and that has caused our world to crumble, and sin and the curse of God came in, and he's going to redeem it. But if you don't believe in a sort of Christian worldview, and we can discuss that more in the Q&A, your worldview doesn't account for this. So I think you have greater problems if you're not a believer in God when it comes to the question of suffering. You don't have a worldview that allows you to ask the question. There is no problem. Suffering is trivialized. Your question is redundant. There's no right and wrong, and human life doesn't even matter anyway. The atheist has no explanatory power to the feelings, the emotions, and the thoughts that they have. As C.S. Lewis said, it's too simple. It seems so good, but it's too simple. And by the way, final thing on the philosophical answer. If you have a God big and powerful enough to be mad at for not stopping evil and suffering, you have to have a God big and powerful enough to have a reason for not stopping evil and suffering. You see, you cannot say, well, because I, in my view, in my culture, at my moment in history, cannot see why God would be allowing this, so there can be no reason. Well, who are you? Who are you? In the big scheme of eternity, in the big scheme of even human history, you've got the view on why this might be happening. No, if you've got a God who's big and powerful enough to be mad at for allowing evil and suffering, you have to have a God who's big and wise enough to have reasons for it, even if you never understand them in this lifetime. Philosophically, that works. I mean, evil and suffering exist, therefore God cannot not exist. That's the premise, that's the conclusion. No, evil and suffering exist, therefore God might have reasons to exist, therefore you haven't disproved this. That's how Alvin Plantinga did it years ago in his book on Evil and Freedom. So that's the philosophical answer. And I hope to have some good questions in the chat pack. What about the personal answer? Okay, Christianity may have a worldview, and that may have provoked some of you to think through what the consequences are if you don't believe in God. But I actually think Christianity gives us a unique hope, a unique comfort, and a unique peace. Amongst all religions, all worldviews, all cultures, certainly against secularism, a unique hope, a unique comfort, and a unique peace. COVID-19 is no respecter of persons or national borders or wealth or status. You can be a doctor in emergency in the matter of Andrew with all his qualifications. It doesn't respect you. We're all equals before it. And this has always been true of suffering. It doesn't matter how, wealthy you are or how much, what part of the world you live in. You may get different levels of it, but every one of us experiences suffering. No one is immune to suffering. And so the question is, how do we find peace? Christianity may not have all the knockdown answers. Andrew talked about mystery in his testimony. I thought that was superb. But I want to argue that Christianity is the last one standing because it offers us a resource that no other religion, worldview, or culture offers us, and never has done and never could do. There's one thing in Christianity, one thing that sets it apart from everything else, that makes it unique, that means we have a unique hope, a unique comfort, and a unique peace. One thing. The answer God gives when we cry out, "Why are you allowing this suffering to go on?" is this. It's his son on a bloody cross. The Christian message is God entered the world of suffering. He took on flesh and bones. He experienced everything we experienced and were, and it culminated with his death on a cross. Our God has suffered. Our God was crucified. Our God died. When Stephen Fry, and he's right to say it if he feels it, but if Stephen Fry says, "Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world that is so full of injustice and pain? He must be a moral monster. He's evil and capricious." That terrible caricature of God is smashed to smithereens by the cross of Christ. He felt the physical pain as the cat of nine tails was impaled on his back. He knew unbearable thirst to such an extent that his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth, and he winced as the nails were shoved through his wrists. He felt emotional pain of being mocked, laughed at, spat upon, and humiliated by his accusers, as well as being abandoned by his best friends. Physical pain. Emotional pain, and he felt relational and spiritual pain when his Father in heaven rejects him as he takes on the sin of the world. And Jesus on the cross, you can read it in all the Gospels, says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" You see, God could have remained distant and far off. He could have been that mean and capricious God that Stephen Fry articulates, but he didn't. He came down and entered our world of suffering and death. He participated in one thing. He was infected by the virus. And he died of it, in a sense. He experienced what we experienced. So that brings comfort. A crucified God brings comfort because it means we're not alone. When you are going through suffering, as a mother holds her dying baby, as a young boy watches his father lose the fight against cancer. Andrew mentioned this in his personal story. All the books written and all the eloquent words on why couldn't matter less. When you are confronted with the raw reality of evil and suffering, what is needed is someone who understands you to come alongside you and hold your hand and give you a hug and tell them and tell you they love you. And even better than sympathizing with you, they empathize. They can say, "I know what you're going through. I've been there too." Have you lost a child? God lost a child. Have you been isolated and rejected? So's God. Have you suffered loneliness even in this COVID experience? God suffered terrible loneliness. Have you wanted to give up on life? We read Jesus' prayers. He talks about his soul being overwhelmed with sorrow. Have you been treated unfairly? So's God. Whatever we say, the answer is so has God, because of that picture. Corrie ten Boom, a survivor of the Holocaust and a Christian, wrote this: "There is no pit so deep that God's love is not deeper still. He's gassed in Auschwitz. He's destroyed in the Indian Ocean tsunami. He's infected and isolated during COVID-19. Every tear we shed becomes his tear. He's not disinterested and distant. He draws alongside. He sympathizes. In fact, better, he empathizes because he himself has suffered." It doesn't mean the pain goes away. It doesn't mean there's not suffering and evil. It doesn't mean there's not agony and crying and heartache and loss. But it means God understands. God understands. The God of the universe understands. He knows what you're going through. In other words, I may not have the answers to why God is allowing this suffering, but I know what the answer isn't. It isn't that he doesn't love me. I may not know what the answer is, but I know what the answer is, and it isn't that he doesn't love me. The cross of Christ shows that he loves me. So firstly, we have comfort, unique to Christianity, because our crucified God, we're not alone. Secondly, we get hope. The future is always bright. We never have to ultimately despair. You see, not only did God enter the worst suffering imaginable on the cross, 3 days later, he rose again and beat humanity's great enemy. Why is COVID-19 so bad? Because we die of it. Jesus beat death. He beat our worst enemy. The resurrection assures me, and by the way, the resurrection is unique to Christianity. You won't find another religion or worldview that talks about resurrection in the same way, a physical resurrection. That's someone in history who rose from the dead. It's a unique idea to Christianity. And the resurrection assures me that the brokenness of our world will one day be fixed. It means all the bits of our world that are kind of nice will remain, but all the bits that are marred will be put right. The New Testament talks about the new creation. It's even better language than heaven. The idea that this world will one day be made new. And all that we imagine this world should be, that subconscious idea that we all have, will come true. The new creation in the New Testament is a place of no tears, no pain, no crying, no mourning, no sadness, no loneliness, no heartache, no anguish, no greed, no injustice, no death, no disease, no exploitation, no COVID-19, no isolation, no boredom, no job loss, no financial devastation, no fear, no panic, no stress, no anxiety, no sense of exhausting relentlessness of our world today. None of that's there. But instead we have feasting and laughter. We have joy and wine, we have happiness and friendship, we have harmony and satisfaction. We have perfect enjoyment of all good things. You see, the resurrection assures three things. Firstly, consolation. For everything we lost in this world, we'll get consolation. Restoration, we'll actually get it back. But more than that, complete satisfaction. All of our desires, every dream, every desire we ever had that was never fulfilled, everything we ever enjoyed, everything we wanted to do we couldn't do, we'll have that and 10 times more. Consolation, restoration, and everything we ever wanted and so much more. So in his book on the problem of pain, again, Lewis says this: they say of some temporal suffering that no future bliss can make up for it, not knowing that heaven, once attained, will work backwards and turn even that agony into a glory. There's consolation, there's restoration, and then there's something more wonderful because we've suffered. Mother Teresa, who saw her fair share of suffering, didn't she? She said, in light of heaven, the worst suffering on earth, a life full of the most atrocious torture on earth, will seem to be no more serious than a night in an inconvenient hotel. That was Andrew was talking about, wasn't it? The eternal picture of God. So we get comfort. God is with us. I may not know what the answer is to why I'm suffering, but I know what it isn't. It's not that he doesn't love me. The cross assures me of that. I get hope, resurrection, afterlife, consolation, restoration, complete satisfaction of all desires. But then I also get peace. Tonight's topic, this is not all wasted. If you're a secular person and you don't believe in God and you just believe in a materialistic world, and when you face death, it's just oblivion after death. There's no afterlife, there's no greater story, there's no God, there's nothing, then well, no wonder we panic. No wonder we get fearful in the face of death, because our whole meaning of life is going to be put in jeopardy. Historically, all other religions and worldviews and cultures said the meaning of life was located out of this world. Not just Christianity, all religions and worldviews and cultures. A God, an afterlife, reincarnation, a state of nirvana. You go and look at the different religions. They all have your meaning of life is located outside of this world. It's not just Christianity. So therefore, they could equip their members to suffer well because their meaning of life wasn't actually part of this world. Their ultimate meaning was outside of it. So suffering could actually enhance your meaning of life. It could enable you to better enter into your meaning of life. The suffering could help you. But the modern secular culture is the least able to equip its members to suffer because we have no resources to draw on. If our meaning of life is bound up in this life, then when you suffer and you die, it can't ever enhance your meaning in life. It just destroys it. It only takes it away. I'm not surprised we panic and fear and we can't face it. We have no resources. If your meaning in life is success, money, health, relationships, family, the environment, social and political causes, romance, work, career, kids, a nice house, whatever, like all good things. But if they are your meaning, your essence, your very being, what drives you, what gets you up, what makes life, well, suffering just destroys it, doesn't it? Your whole point of being doesn't have any, your meaning of life is destroyed. And so we panic and we fear. But if your meaning in life is to know, to love, and to enjoy God now and forever, and all his good gifts when they arrive, and when they don't arrive, we just keep enjoying him. Suffering does not destroy your meaning in life. In fact, as I am personally finding as a Christian at this time, is enhancing my meaning in life. I'm discovering it in new and fresher ways. Sociologists have well documented that our modern secular culture is the least equipped, is least able to equip its members to deal with suffering. Yet, especially in the Western world, we have extraordinary amounts of comfort and ease and wealth and healthcare compared to most of the world, and certainly most of history. And yet most of the world and most of history has handled suffering better than our culture, and we've had it the best we've ever had it. Why? Because there's no other meaning than what you can find in this life, and therefore suffering just destroys your meaning, and that's why we end up with so much panic and anxiety. You see, as a Christian, I can have peace because in all the chaos, in all the unknowns, I know God has a plan with it all, and there's a future, therefore it's not wasted. Think about the cross again. When God dies, when Jesus, the Son of God, dies on a cross, if you know the gospel accounts, no one thinks anything good is happening. No one's even there. All the disciples have fled. There's a few women and they're weeping. Everyone thinks devastation. The teacher, the Messiah, the rabbi, he's gone. We put our hopes in him. Everyone thought, what's going on? God has abandoned. The enemies are winning. Hope is over. All was lost. At the cross, no one saw anything good. No one. Except the enemies who thought they were winning and they were losing. But no one saw anything good. And yet God was bringing about something marvelous out of the most devastating suffering that no one could see the good of. Which means for your suffering, for your loss, for your hurt, when you can't understand it, and you may never understand it, this side of eternity, it's not wasted. If God is both loving and powerful, and if he can turn the death of his son into a greater glory than any of us could ever imagine, he can do the same in your life. Wow. Do you see the resources Christianity has because of a crucified God that are unique? There's no other religion, worldview, or culture that has anything like it. We have comfort. We're not alone. God understands and he loves me. I don't know what the answer I don't know what the answer is as to why he's allowing it, but I know what the answer is, and it's not that he doesn't love me. We have hope. The resurrection assures me of consolation, restoration, and complete satisfaction beyond my wildest dreams. And we have purpose, so therefore we have peace. Even if it feels wasted, it's not. The cross shows me that. It gives me the essential perspective. Can we find peace in suffering? I think so, if you believe in a crucified God. Let me end with a quote from one of my favorite authors. He's called John Stott, and he says this: I could never myself believe in God if it were not for the cross. In the real world of pain, how could one worship a God who is immune to it? I've entered many Buddhist temples in different Asian countries and stood respectfully before the statue of Buddha. His legs crossed, arms folded, eyes closed, the ghost of a smile playing around his mouth, a remote look on his face, detached from the agonies of the world. But each time, after a while, I've had to turn away. And in my imagination, I've instead turned to that lonely, twisted, tortured figure on the cross, nailed through hands and feet, back lacerated, limbs wrenched, brow bleeding with thorn pricks, mouth dry, intolerably thirsty, plunged into God-forsaken darkness. That is the God for me. He laid aside his immunity to pain. He entered our world of flesh and blood, tears and death. He suffered for us. Our suffering becomes more manageable in light of his. There was still a question mark against human suffering, but over it we must boldly stamp another mark, the cross, which symbolizes divine suffering. He ends, the cross of Christ is God's only self-justification in a world such as ours. I think philosophically, you have greater problems if you get rid of God when you're trying to face the question of suffering. And I think personally, if you get rid of God, you have none of the resources. And then when you have Christianity, which has a crucified God You have comfort. We're not alone. We have hope. The future is bright. And we have peace. This is not wasted. That's why it's unique. That's why I am a believer in Jesus and follow him. So thanks for listening. The aim of intro is always to provoke question, engage discussion, and give you a chance to disagree and ask and answer questions respectfully. So I'm going to put the evening back over to Pat and Isaac, and they're going to host for the next bit. Thanks for listening.
Great. Steve, that was fantastic. Thank you. We look forward to hearing more from you shortly in just a second in the Q&A that's around the corner. Just a bit of housekeeping, guys. First of all, I'm getting stick from all angles from a number of mediums for constantly clicking my pen. So first of all, I apologize for that. Isaac, that is now your responsibility. If I click my pen again, it's your fault. Okay, Mum, I'm really sorry that I'm clicking my pen. Yeah, so now is your chance to send in any questions. Please do. We've had a few trickling in. You can send them in a number of ways. You can put them in on the Zoom chat. You can text the number at the top right-hand corner of your screen. You can tweet us. I'm not a great social media guy, so I might get the lingo wrong, but you can gram us.
DM
us.
DM.
You can on gram.
On Instagram.
Instagram.
There we go.
You can DM us on Instagram. So you can get in contact in a number of ways. Please do be doing that. Send through your questions. As I say, we've got a couple coming in really quickly in 30 seconds before we jump into Q&A, and we're going to have more of this later. But Isaac, if someone's listening now and they think, I want to hear a bit more from Christ City Church, I want to get involved a little bit more, how are they going to do that?
100%, guys. So we are a church. We're called Christ City Church Dublin. And, we're on Instagram. We're on Twitter. So give us a follow. You could give us a message there. Maybe you want to have a chat with us. So give us a message and we'll be able to chat with you guys there. Also, if you go on to our website, again, just look up Christ City Church Dublin. You'll be able to then get onto a list. I want to find out more. Go through that form. We'll get onto our mailing list and you can find out what's going on in the church as well. Hopefully, it's in the works that we're going to do another one of these events, another intro event. So guys, make sure you're still following Intro Dublin on Instagram and Twitter, and you'll be able to see what's coming on. And finally, guys, why don't you come to church? Why don't you come to us? Normally we meet on Sing Street in Dublin. However, now we meet on Zoom, 4:30 on a Sunday afternoon. What else are you going to be doing? Why don't you come along? Right.
Cheers, Isaac. Edwin's just texted me to say I'm a grandma. So that's really good banter. Cheers, Edwin. That's cool. Great. Let's have a few questions. Question number 1. Okay. Let's go with this one first. I understand, says our anonymous texter, or he may not be anonymous, but I don't know his name. I understand that God allows suffering and that this is a fallen world. But why do some people suffer so much more in this world than others? Good question. I understand that God allows suffering, fallen world, but why some more than others? Andrew, can I send that one your way? And then Steve, you might want to pick up on that after Andrew said his bit.
Right. I think that's a really, really good question. And that's probably one of the biggest questions there. I don't have a philosophical answer, so to speak. But I suppose the quick answer is, why do some people suffer so much more in this world than others? The answer is, I don't know. And that's it. I think we'll never get to the bottom of why suffering in this side of the world. But I think underneath that question, I asked myself, why do I even ask that question in the first place? And I think the motivation in that question for me personally is the injustice of it. The injustice that the suffering does not equate sort of the moral of that person. And, and I think that's very much a worldview of that the justice happens now, right? So like if I do good things should happen, or if I do bad things, then the punishment will happen, and that happens immediately. So when we see that a good person goes through something really bad, the result does not equate, and we don't see the immediacy of a positive result. So so I think that's it. That's I think the error is that we assume that justice happens now. Mm-hmm. And coming from a worldview of Christianity, we know that there's eternity. We know that God promises that there will be justice at the end, that everything would be fixed to the way that it's supposed to be. So that gives me comfort, knowing that God is a God of justice, and but that He looks through the lens of eternity, and therefore sometimes our reality does not equate what we feel the justice should be. Yeah, that's just my journey so far. Anyway, I don't know if that helps, and if there's anything, Steve or guys, you guys want to add.
I think that's super helpful, Andrew. Thank you. I think I totally agree. We don't know why. And I think the other thing I would say there is look at Jesus, the most pure, perfect man that ever lived, and yet he suffered greatly. So the Christianity has this idea that, you know, it's not that the wicked get punishment now and the good people, you know, get good things now. Look at Jesus, the innocent sufferer. So and I think I would agree with Andrew that we're now assuming a moral framework that says if you live morally you get rewarded, and if you live badly you don't. Well, where does that come from? And I guess the second question onto that one is, has anyone ever really lived so good that they don't deserve suffering? So my understanding is, and it actually helps me, it brings comfort. If I suffer, I go, well, listen, I'm a sinner and I deserve death. I deserve it. So I don't start from a starting place of we don't deserve the suffering. I start, if we're saying there's a moral framework that good people should, you know, the good people should get a good life and the bad people should get a bad life. Well, why am I assuming I'm a good person? Now, there's clearly disparity. You know, there's clearly Mother Teresa versus Hitler. And then I go to, well, look, God, you know, often brings his most beloved people through the toughest times. And if you look at the book of Job, Old Testament book of Job, if you really want to wrestle with how God treats his friends, look at the book of Job. And I don't know any person in my life who's suffered as bad as he has. And yet God had a special eye on him, and it was part of some wonderful story. So we don't know why. I totally agree. I definitely think eternity is the answer. But I think it's helping us. Well, why do we expect any of us to not as well? But it's tough. Like, that is tough. Like, it's you know, one of my favorite Psalms, Psalm 73, wrestles with it. Like, why do the righteous suffer and the wicked, you know, prosper? That's a tough reality. And I think we're, as Andrew said in his story, allowed to wrestle with God with that and ask God and work through that. So we don't know why, but there may be some helpful insights for you. If follow-up questions on that or anything else, Pat?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Really good. Thank you, Steve and Andrew. Again, as you say, Steve, whoever asked that question, please feel free to follow up, ask another question on top of it, and to come back at Andrew and Steve on that. Thanks for asking. We've got 2 questions here, but we're having quite a few questions come in, so I hope you don't mind. I'm going to put 2 questions together. Question number 1 that I'm going to put together is, great question. I believe in God, but I don't believe in Christianity. God exists, but who says Jesus is God? Who says this gospel of yours is real? Great question. I think that's similar to this question as well, if I may. It's a nice idea that Christianity provides comfort, peace, and hope. But what if it's just wishful thinking? So I guess for our panelists, the reason I put this question together is I feel the question is, yeah, cool, okay, God probably exists. God may or may not exist. And yeah, if he does, that might bring peace, hope, and suffering. But who says this guy Jesus is the answer? Jesus might bring peace, but how can we know? How can we believe? Is it just wishful thinking? Rebecca, let's bring you in. We haven't heard from you yet. Do you want to take a stab at that? Is Christianity just wishful thinking? God might exist, but this fella Jesus 2,000 years ago can't know anything about him.
Yeah, absolutely. So for you guys that don't know me, my name is Rebecca. I'm currently in 3rd year studying law at Trinity. So yeah, great question. And yeah, C.S. Lewis, in one of his books, because we really like C.S. Lewis apparently tonight, he says that there's 3 conclusions that you can draw about Jesus: that either he was mad, that he was bad, or that he really was the Son of God. And in thinking about this question, there's actually a load of evidence that points to the fact that he really was the Son of God. So firstly, there was a document at the time called the Babylonian Talmud. Now, this was written by actually sort of the people who hated Jesus at the time, the Pharisees, the religious leaders, and they sought to discredit Jesus. And essentially what they say in this document is, yeah, Jesus did perform miracles, so there's accounts in the Gospels, which are in the New Testament in the Bible, that he fed 5,000 and he heals people, and he brought Lazarus back from the dead, and he did all these things. But they said that was not through God's power, but through the power of the devil, and through he was evil. And so that fits what they were trying to argue, is he was this bad man, so even Jesus's enemies recognized that he could do powerful and amazing things. Now, secondly, there's also a lot of prophecy. So if we go back to the Old Testament, back to about 700 years before Jesus is even born, you have this book called the book of Isaiah. Isaiah was a prophet. And in Isaiah 53, you have this account that's basically saying that there's this coming of the Messiah, this man who would be what the Jewish people were waiting for, this person who was going to come in and save them. And in reading that passage, there's so many things. It talks about a man who would be despised and rejected, who would be pierced, who would be beaten, who would be persecuted, who would be ridiculed, and all these things fit exactly what would happen to Jesus hundreds of years later, which I just think couldn't be a coincidence, and that this is not something that it just happened in that one moment, but it's been planned for all of history to this point. And another quick thing is, I think that all the Jesus' friends and the disciples, the 12 disciples, every single one of them basically ended up dying horrific deaths. They were, martyred for this cause. And I just think, why would you bother dying for someone that you weren't totally convinced really was the Son of God? So those would be some things that I would pose to you to think about. And I'm sure Steve or Andrew might have some more to add there.
No, just to affirm, yeah. I mean, brilliantly put. I think you've got to look, just to maybe another way of phrasing these, you've got to look at the reliability of the New Testament Gospel documents. Go to the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin and check them out. You've got to look at the historical evidence for Jesus and what are the alternative explanations. You've got to look at what the enemies of Jesus said about him and why they said that and all the rest. You've got to look at the spread of Christianity and how do you count for this? I mean, the secular historians are pulling their hair out going, how do we account for the fact that the thing just exploded in the Roman world against opposition? The only explanation I guess the Christians have is, well, he really rose and they really saw him. And I think Rebecca's point, like, these people in the Gospels, they paint themselves in such bad light. They die for what they believe. Like, the apostles, we're not liars themselves, and not hypocrites. They're sort of normal people trying to get on with normal life, and they pay a price for it. So I think that when you put all that together, you have a pretty compelling case. A couple of extra thoughts then. So that's all sort of from what Rebecca said. A couple of extra thoughts is, why Christianity? Well, I kind of said the cross, didn't I? What makes it different from all others is that God came to us rather than we go to, all the other religions and worldviews. It's like, be good enough, do good enough, you get to him. And that creates pressure and guilt and stress and, me working hard. Christianity says God came to you when you were in a mess and he rescued you out of it. So it's this idea of grace, not that we do stuff to get to him, but that he's done stuff to come to us. And so that message of salvation is so different from everything else. So I'd also say that as well. And just then to come back on the second half of the question, well, it might give us peace and comfort and hope, but that's just doesn't mean it's true. Thank you for whoever asked this question. Vitally important question. You don't believe Christianity because it's utilitarian alone. You believe one because it's truthful. And so that's a key. I think I did do maths and philosophy, and Blaise Pascal, one of the most famous mathematicians and philosophers of all time, a Christian, he wrote a little book called Ponces, and he puts it in there. He says, you've got to make people wish it were true, so they would spend the time investigating whether it is. So I guess, like, the beginning of my talk was like, hey, philosophically, this holds up a bit on the issue of suffering. We haven't had time to look at the resurrection or the New Testament documents or the evidence for Christ. And okay, that's another talk. But I am trying to, in one sense, I'm trying to give you compelling reasons to go, I really hope this is true, and I'm going to go and find out if it is. And if you think that, then I feel really encouraged that we've done our job tonight. So I know we haven't proved Christianity is true today. We've tried to say, has Christianity got resources? You've got to go and do the hard work and say, is it true? And I would commend you to do that. And we're happy to have the conversations around some of those reliability questions. So yeah, just thank you for a great question and hugely important. Pat, you did this. This is your stuff, the evidence of Christianity in the first 500 years. That's what you studied at Cambridge. Anything else you want to add about the historicity and evidence for?
Yeah, well, certainly the first 50 to 100 years of the Christian faith was what I went into detail in my dissertation and in my study years before that. It's fascinating stuff. And absolutely, as I did that, as I studied that, I realized that actually it was a much harder leap of faith for me to say, actually, this is nonsense, than to say, actually, no, I believe this. There's so many great questions to pose. I think you pose a good one. What about those disciples? Why did they go off and just die for something they were convinced happened? What do people say? Well, they say, well, hold on, Patrick. Loads of people die for beliefs all the time. That's right. Here in Ireland, we have a long tradition of people, Podrick, Pearce and co, dying for Irish republicanism. But this was different. They were en masse, many, many people dying for a historical fact, something that could be proved wrong or right. You can't prove Irish republicanism. You can't prove radical Islam wrong or right. You can prove if someone came back to life, yes or no. Did you see it? Did you not? And yet, en masse, these people flooded to their death, saying, we can't recant of this. We're absolutely certain of this. So that's one convincing thing. I think Becca made some wonderful points as well to do with the miracles. The last point I'd add on is his teaching. Do unto others as he would do unto you. Turn the other cheek. Some of the possibly the greatest moral teaching of all time. So this man who did miracles, who potentially rose from the dead, whose followers all died for him, also gave this amazing teaching. Where did he get that from? Where did this uneducated peasant from a backwater in the Roman Empire get the ability to teach like this? So there's this huge collaboration of evidence that I found as a student. It screamed too loudly at me, and I thought, I have to go and give my life to this. This is just true. I can't deny it.
And I guess just circle back where Rebecca started, right? So Jesus, if in his light of his teaching, is therefore mad, bad, or God. You know, someone that says, I'm the light of the world, I'm the resurrection of the life, and all those are things he says, he's either mad, he's just completely not, not there, or he's bad, he's trying to deceive us, or he really is it. That's the C.S. Lewis three options. So just to sort of bring full circle where we started, that's kind of how hopefully giving you some food for thought. Thanks for a great question, and keep them coming.
Great. Now, panelists, we're short on time and loads of questions are coming in. So let's do our best to keep this moving. At the same time, I think we might have to run another one of these events in a week or two because there's a lot of appetite. Anyway, let's move forward. So we've had one really good question. Well, we've had a number of good questions. A good question is, we talk about finding peace, but what is peace? How do we know if we have it? Who wants to take that? What is peace? How do we know if we have it?
I can take it if I can give it a first stab. I think there's a couple of ways of answering that. The first one is the objective answer, which is, do we have peace with God? Ultimately, that's the ultimate peace we need in life, I think, because that's what leads to all other pieces. So if we have peace with God, a relationship with God, which Andrew was sharing how in his story, that's what brought him the peace. It wasn't that he had answers to the suffering, but he had a relationship because he had peace with God himself. Then that's the key to all the other pieces. And one of the reasons we don't have peace, and I try to articulate this in my talk, is because, well, my career, my degree, my relationship, my money, that's where I put my value, my hope in, and that's in jeopardy. So how could I have peace? I mean, how could you have peace right now if your hope is all tied up in this world? But if you're peace with God, then you could trust him that whatever's happening and all of the uncertainty. So I do think the first bit starts with this objective peace we get with God, that relationship and that trust that then fuels our ability to just go through all of life and hold it lightly and not panic and stuff. I also then, that's the sort of logical answer. I also do think there is an experiential answer. We believe in that God not only gave us his son, but gave us his Holy Spirit. And that through the Holy Spirit, we can, there's expressions, for example, in the Bible, which talk about, peace that transcends understanding. And, we don't have answers to it, but we just know that God's got us. I remember a few times, I was very near death a few times in my life. One because of a serious illness that ended up with a crisis, and now I can, fortunately manage it by steroids. But at the time, it was scary, and but I just knew a peace that I was on. The doctors couldn't work out what was wrong with me, and family had all gathered to me because they didn't know. And I just knew a peace that transcended all understanding. I remember another time when I was in South America, and I was just walking down this dirt track, and I turned around and there was 3 pretty nasty looking dogs looking at me, and they were big, and they were just sort of cornered me. And I remember just praying, Lord, please help me now. And I just knew a peace, and I walked, and they just and they're just little examples. The sense of God's with me as I go through things in life. And it doesn't mean we always get deliverance. I think I've tried to show, but it means that we can have peace through not just intellectually knowing I've got peace with God. He's my value. He's my hope. Nothing can take that away from me. The Apostle Paul says, not even death can separate me from the love of God. No height, nor depth, no anything. If I've got peace with God, I'm secure. But then experientially, I can know that he's with me, and that's wonderful. So that's how personally I think I personally would find peace, and I'd encourage you to think through that. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything to that.
No, I think that's really good, Steve. Thank you for that. Let's press on. We've got quite a few to get through. Thanks, Steve. Here's a good question that's just come in. Came in a few minutes ago. Why is Christianity divided into various groups, Catholic, Orthodox, etc.? If the story of God is seemingly straightforward, even undeniable, how and why are they able to disagree over the same beliefs? I'll jump in on that. Great question. Well, I think the Bible would say that the heart of the human problem is the problem of the human heart. So the problem with religion and the problem with Christianity is not God, but the people who claim to believe in it. Humans are really, really flawed. Humans are proud, humans are greedy, humans are selfish, etc. And I think the story of Christianity and the story of Judaism before that, and perhaps the story of all religion, is they divide, they split, and human beings want to take control, want to take the glory, take the honor, etc. And that forces us to fall out with one another. So the heart of the human problem is the problem of the human heart. And on that note, people have done awful things in the name of Christianity, horrendous things, no more so than in Ireland, awful things. And part of that awfulness causes splits, right? Some pastor says, I'm a pastor, and then he does something awful, and we say, actually, we don't want to be part of that anymore. That was the kind of original Protestant Reformation. They said, we don't want to be part of this anymore, and split, and that process continues. I guess it's important to say, though, that don't judge the God necessarily on the people who claim to do things in his name. I'm a really big football fan, soccer. And some people have done awful things in the name of soccer. I'm sure many of us know about the hooliganism that was rampant in English football in the 90s. Awful things. The Hillsborough disaster, well, I suppose that wasn't so much football fans, but the Heysel disaster, the ultras in Russia who are racist and homophobic, etc. Awful things are done in the name of soccer. But I don't stop playing the game. Soccer's still a good game, and I'm still going to play it, even though some people, in a way, steal it and exploit it for their own power and their own desires. I think it's the same with religion. So people do awful things in the name of Christianity. I think that causes splits. The problem is the people. The problem is not Jesus Christ. That would be my response to that. Do any other panelists want to jump in and add or take away from that? If not, we'll have a crack at another question.
Maybe just one extra thought there I can bring in. It's very helpful. Apart from GA being a far more superior sport to soccer, the other thing I would say is the tenets. Obviously, you have sects and stuff, but the tenets of all the different denominations, the core gospel. God, the triune God, Father, Son, and Spirit sent His Son to die. Jesus died on a cross for our sins, rose again from the dead, is coming again. That is across all the different factions, and I think Pat's given a great answer about that. But in sense of there is still one central fundamental truth that means that whatever strand of Christianity you're a Christian, and you're part of the Church of Jesus. And so I would always say focus on the essentials, not the non-essentials. So a great quote that's come down from church history, I have no idea who gave it us, is in essentials unity, in non-essentials liberty, in all things charity. So in essentials, what we really believe, what's the heart of our faith, we have to have unity on that. That's what makes you a Christian. in non-essentials, okay, there's differences around this and that, and church government and baptism and whatever. Okay, liberty, just give people the benefit of the doubt, but in all things charity. So that's been a helpful slogan for me.
Great, thank you, Steve. Okay, how are we doing for time? We've got a few minutes, and then we'll wrap up, and then we might continue possibly. Anyway, well, one more question. What about before Jesus? So, sorry, I'm paraphrasing the question slightly, but fine, Jesus might be the answer to suffering. He might even be the route through death, etc. What about before him? What about all of that human history before him? Do any panelists want to have a stab at that? What was the answer to suffering before Jesus Christ?
I'm happy to have a go. I'll look for the nods from Andrew and Rebecca. Stop me hogging the show. I think, the book of Job in the Bible is the oldest book in the Bible. And I was actually reflecting as I was just reflecting and thinking through today and in the morning. It's the oldest book in the Bible. It's all about suffering. So right there at the start of the human history and the record of what we have in the scriptures was a man who was suffered, who was innocent. So right there you have this wrestling with God and the question of why do the righteous suffer and the wicked get away with it. So in that sense, it's been a question that's always been grappling. That people have grappled with, and Job has always been an example, and he's a hero, and in the New Testament he's held up as a hero, as someone that grappled with God and came through still trusting in God. So in that sense, that there has been lots, and the Psalms. I mean, you just read the Psalms, like there's 150 of them, and at least a third, if not a half, are what are called Psalms of Lament, like David and people going through grief and hardship and dealing with that. So right in the full of the Old Testament, we've got lots of stories of, the story of Joseph. If you know that famous story, and he gets unjustly treated by his brothers and he's shoved in a prison, and there's a story of suffering and then God working that out. And so we have all these stories that happens in the Old Testament, and believers wrestle with God through not knowing. But the way the cross works in the script, the way Jesus works, is he casts a shadow forward and back. So for example, it says of Abraham in Genesis 15 that he believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. So he had a promise of God that he'd receive descendants as numerous as stars in the sky, and he'd become a father of many nations, and God blessed him, and through him God would bless all the nations of the earth. That was his gospel, Paul says in Galatians chapter 3. And he believed God. Now he didn't know how that was all going to tie up. And in Jesus we go, oh, that's how it all works out. But he was believing the revelation of God that he did have. And in the end, the ultimate answer was in Jesus. So he was looking forward. So in that sense, the cross works backwards, and all the resources that we get, we see Old Testament believers looking forward to when that's going to be fulfilled in Jesus. And so Romans chapter 4 is a whole chapter of the Apostle Paul going, well, what are we going to do about Abraham? And what are we going to do about David? Literally, they're the questions. If the gospel is coming Jesus, well, what are we doing with the two heroes of our Old Testament? And he says, oh, this is how it works. They were believing in the promises of God that they had for their season. So that's what happened in the Old Testament. Well, certainly there's a start of an answer for that.
Great. Thank you, Steve, for that. I hope that's helpful for whoever asked the question. I'm sure it is. Okay, this might be our last formal question of the evening while we've got everyone here. We might carry on a little bit afterwards, but we'll chat about that in a second. Andrew, this is for you. This is a slightly more personal tone. Was there a point at which you felt God particularly meet or impact your faith during the last few months?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's a lot from what I experienced in the last couple of weeks to pull from. One that came up to me, and Steve mentioned earlier about something that you experienced, like a more of an experiential moment with God through all of this is, I'm just trying to make sure that I'm telling the story correctly. So basically, early on when Ola, we knew that Ola was sick and she had to be kept in the hospital, we didn't tell our family members. Her parents were in Poland, my parents live in Taiwan. We just didn't want them to worry. But it got to the point where it was concerning enough. We said, look, we have to tell them. So I remember it was a couple of days after she went in that I told my parents that, Ola is sick, and, this could mean this and this to the baby and to Ola. So they were naturally concerned. So what happened then was, what my mom, after we finished chatting on video chat, she went and she was just sort of praying. And then half an hour after she was into her devotion and praying, that my mom yeah, she is a very logical person. She used to be an atheist, but then she's come to know Jesus, but still she retains that very logical side of her. She texted me and she said, look, Andrew, I was just praying at the moment, and then at the kitchen, then I heard a small little something dropped in the kitchen. So I went in to have a look. And on the floor was a magnet next to the fridge. So if you know my house, we have loads of magnets of places that we've been in. They're all destination magnets. But on that fridge, there's one magnet that is not a destination magnet. And that was the magnet that fell. And she actually sent me a picture of it. And this was the magnet that fell. And the one magnet that fell out of all the destination magnets was a verse that points to Psalms 121:8. And that magnet that fell says that the Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and forevermore. And I don't have the time to go through the entire passage, but at that moment, that was the exact words that I needed to hear about, you know, in my time of helplessness, in my time where I feel like I couldn't do anything, to know that God is the one. You know, he says that David cries out, where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth, and he will watch over it coming and going. And it just felt like a very personal word, that God will be the one to look after Ola and look after our baby Theo in their coming and going. So yeah, that was a moment where it felt that God was there with me, and felt that God grew my faith to prepare me for what was ahead that week.
Thank you, Andrew. And I think you make a powerful point, which is there's sort of two sides to Christianity that I see. There's the objective, historical, rigorous, or even philosophical discussion that we've been having tonight, and then there's the really personal stuff of how he impacts you, how he impacts me. I'm sure, Isaac, how you've seen him impact your own life, which is of course harder to verify one way or the other. But it's remarkable that both come in tandem, and it's when they come together that I think faith really bursts into action. Guys, we're going to begin drawing the evening to a close. There's a little bit more to say, but we'll be done informally or formally in a couple of minutes, and we might informally carry on for a little longer. Isaac, before we do so, let's just be clear. If someone's come for the first time and thought, I want to find out a little bit more, or I want to know more about Christ City Church, where do they go?
100%, guys. So as we've said, you know, we are on Instagram. Give us a follow. Also, as you can see on these slides now, so we're doing another follow-up to this, again, another one of these intros. So if you've enjoyed this, do come along. This one's going to be, does Jesus' resurrection provide the answer? So that's Wednesday, 13th of May, 7 p.m. via Zoom. So it's the same thing again, guys. We'd really love to see you guys there. Again, there's so many other things you could be carrying on doing as well. We have our Sunday services. We are a church. Come along. 4:30 every Sunday on Zoom. Go onto our website, you'll find it there, Christ City Church Dublin. And then, of course, we have other things going on as well. Midweek discussion groups, Zoom coffees. There's so many different ways. Even if you're just looking for like casual chats, come along to us as well. And again, all that information is going to be on our website, Christ City Church Dublin. But please do stay in touch. Email us, send us a message on Instagram, Twitter. We'd love to be in touch. Thanks, guys.
Great. Thank you, Isaac. That is absolutely scandalous that we haven't mentioned this yet. So there is a follow-up event 2 weeks time, Wednesday, 13th of May, 7 p.m. Similar structure, different question. Please do come along. It'd be great to see you there. We shouldn't have left it to the last minute of the conversation to mention that. Great. So that's 2 weeks time. Other than that, all the other stuff Isaac mentioned, please hop in as well. Okay, guys, here's what's going to happen now. We're going to draw to a close. Some of you might work from home. Some of you might have been on Zoom or Google or whatever it may be all day, and you just need to get away, and that is cool. So please feel free now to take your leave. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate so many coming along, and we really particularly appreciate people who are brave enough to get stuck in and ask their questions. So feel free to take your leave now. But what we will do is we're going to hang on, some of us, the panelists, and maybe a few others might want to stay with us and just answer one or two more questions. And then if a few more come in, then we might spill over for another few minutes as well. So guys, thank you for coming. Now's your opportunity to make a move. It's been great to have you. We hope to see you maybe on a Sunday or in 2 weeks' time. Thanks, guys.